Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you. My name is Elaine Howard Ecklund, and I am a professor of sociology at Rice University in the US, and was privileged to be principal investigator for the Religion Among Scientists in International Context Study, a global research initiative to understand how scientists in 8 different global regions understand the connection among religion, ethics, and gender. My deepest thanks to each of you for joining us today for our lecture titled Science and Religion: Why Hong Kong and Taiwan Are Different. We do not take your participation in this event for granted, and we want to extend a special thanks to the Faith and Science Collaborative Research Forum at the University of Hong Kong for co-sponsoring this lecture, and to Michael Brownnutt for helping to make this possible. We also want to give our thanks to the Templeton World Charity Foundation and the Templeton Religion Trust for generously funding this research initiative, the analysis and outreach that resulted. First, Professor Pauline Chu, Professor of Chemistry from the University of Hong Kong, will formally open our event. We are grateful again to the University of Hong Kong for hosting us in this very special environment where some of us are virtual and some of us are in person. I will then start our presentation by setting the context for the discussion. Then Professor David Johnson, who is an associate professor of educational policy studies at Georgia State University, will present some of the key findings from the global study. And Professor D.D., who is an assistant professor of sociology at Santa Clara University, will end the presentation by talking about the specific findings in Hong Kong and Taiwan. After the presentation, there will be time dedicated to questions from the audience. Please note that audio, video, and chat will be disabled during our comments, as is usual during a webinar, but you will be able to submit your questions via the Zoom question and answer function during our remarks, which we very much encourage you to do. The instructions for the question and answer will appear in the chat window shortly. I am now so very pleased to introduce Professor Pauline Chu, who will be formally opening our lecture. Professor Chu has served as a professor in organic chemistry at the University of Hong Kong since 2011. She is a co-principal investigator for the Faith and Science Collaborative Research Forum and a member of the Executive Committee of Faith and Global Engagement at the University of Hong Kong. Professor Chu received a PhD from the University of Toronto and completed her postdoctoral work at Columbia University. Her research interests are in cycloaddition and cascade reactions and development of new methodology as applied to natural product total synthesis and medicinal chemistry. Welcome, Professor Chu. We are so honored to be with you. Thank you so much.
The pleasure is all mine, and I'm so happy and so honored to be actually part of this event. And just want to also extend a very warm welcome to today's seminar from wherever the audience is and whatever time zone. And whatever time zone that is, I just really appreciate that you're all here with intent and effort. Here in this physical space, we have a venue here where we have a number of participants, as well as this virtual space. So Professor Ecklund has already kindly, have a brief introduction of myself. Well, I just want to add that here I feel like I am a fish out of the water. I am a professor in chemistry here at the university, and I would say that I'm a hardcore scientist, but I do have this interest in the humanities. And as Professor Ecklund has said, I've been part of this project here at the university called FASTCORE, which is the Faith and Science Collaborative Research Forum. This project was started and still funded by the Templeton World Charity Foundation as well. And the aims are that we would hope that through this project, there would be a better mutual understanding and a dialogue among all academics especially those in the STEM field and with the issues of faith and ethics. In our project, we have been, of course, very interested in the study conducted by Professor Elaine Howard Ecklund and her colleagues. And because this study is the largest and most comprehensive international study ever undertaken, and they have interviewed about over 20,000 scientists from all over the world and have surveyed the scientists' attitudes towards various issues, including religion, gender, and ethics. I just want to say that the results have been published as a book, and here it is, Secularity and Science, What Scientists in the World Really Think About Religion by Oxford University Press. They have been very prolific in their publications and writings. And I want to also mention that the team members who are speaking to us today have also recently published another textbook, another book called Varieties of Atheism in Science. It was just published this year by Oxford University Press. So what is really interesting to us here in Hong Kong is that, as the title suggests, that this study found that a sort of anomaly for scientists living and working in Hong Kong and Taiwan compared with the rest of the world. And as a practicing scientist in Hong Kong, I had not been aware that we had been statistically different from other scientists in the world. So we're very interested to find out what is this difference and what are the reasons behind it. How do we understand the scientific mind and culture through these findings? And then how should we proceed to enable fruitful dialogues in which we can better appreciate the views and contributions by all members of the larger community in Hong Kong and beyond, which is very much part of the mission of FastCore. Without giving too much away, I just want to ask you and invite you to stay tuned as Professor Ecklund and her collaborators, Professor David Johnson, and also Professor Didi, will share with us their findings in this public lecture entitled Science and Religion, Why Hong Kong and Taiwan Are Different. So without further ado, let me first invite back Professor Ecklund to start off this lecture.
Thank you so much, Professor Chu. That was such a warm introduction, and I know our team so wishes we could be there physically in Hong Kong. It had been one of our dreams to be there physically, but doing this lecture in this format also does allow, of course, many others to join from other global regions as well. So thank you so much. It's really our honor to be with you in this way. Some of our lecture material today is based on the book, as Professor Chu kindly introduced it, Secularity and Science, What Scientists Around the World Really Think About Religion. And that book was published in 2019. And I want to make sure I mention our colleagues who are co-authors on that book, Brandon Vajanathan, Kirsten Matthews, Stephen W. Lewis, and Robert Thompson Jr., in addition, of course, to Dee, David Johnson, and myself. And then we have the new book, Varieties of Atheism in Science. So some of the information comes from that, and some of it is other things that we haven't yet presented. Science and religion are two of the most influential institutions across the globe. Religion in all its varied forms is enormously significant in the global sphere. 5.8 billion individuals, nearly 85% of the global population, belong to a religious tradition. Science is also significant. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development estimates that in 2015, the global science and engineering workforce in OECD countries was 4.8 million. So it is the group of people who are scientists is not as large as the group of people who consider themselves religious, but science has a particular kind of cultural preeminence, as we know, and any nation that is growing economically is trying to grow its science and technology infrastructure. And whether we like it or not, it is a social reality that the science and faith interface lives large in the public imagination around the world. And given that nations across the globe vary greatly in their scientific and religious characteristics, we then need to study the globe, to study different areas around the world to fully understand the character of the religion and science interface. We need to only turn to the UK, where Richard Dawkins, the former University of Oxford's professor for the public understanding of science, has argued in front of an audience of millions in the New York Times bestselling book, The God Delusion, that religion and science are not ever compatible. Meanwhile, Dr. Francis Collins, director of the US National Institutes of Health and a leading voice in the fight against the COVID pandemic, in his own language of God, tries to convince his readers that science is completely compatible with his own faith as a Christian. These debates are found not just in the lives of individual scientists, but they make their way into the public sphere. In the US, we see debates about whether creationism should be taught alongside evolution in public schools, and religious concerns about the use of human embryonic stem cells in research. Similar tensions are found elsewhere across the globe. Research shows us that views on the science and faith interface have an impact on important social issues. Things like how people seek healthcare, how scientists think about their work and respond to the public, and of course, as we're all intimately aware, how we respond to a global pandemic. What is less apparent, however, is what scientists around the globe actually think about religion and how such views may inform other social issues. In particular, studying what scientists think about the religion and science interface in Hong Kong and Taiwan, as we did, is deeply important. Most research on science and religion has been focused on the US and the UK. Most research has also been focused on monotheistic traditions and Christianity specifically, rather than being conducted in nations where there are other religious traditions present or even dominant. Most research on the science and religion interface has assumed a deep conflict perspective. In general, we have so much to learn from comparative work, and we need to do research work that examines societies with dominant religious traditions outside of Christianity, as well as Christianity in national contexts outside the US and the UK. During this talk, we want to make 6 key points. First, we want to argue that around the world, there are more religious scientists than many have said, and I think this will come as a surprise to some. Second, that Hong Kong and Taiwan are unique and vitally important cases globally to understand the science and religion interface, and that others have much to learn from these cases. Third, we'll argue that atheist scientists are more varied than we might think. And fourth, that most scientists do not see religion and science as actually conflicting, which is also surprising to many. We also want to argue, fifth, that religion and science connect in the workplace at times, even for those scientists who are not actually personally religious. And sixth, in some of our most recent work, we want to show you a little bit about how we need to understand gender and science from a global perspective. I'm going to start by offering a few details about the methods of the study. The initial data collection began in 2012, and analysis has continued since then. Our study included 8 international contexts. We studied France, Hong Kong, India, Italy, Taiwan, Turkey, the United Kingdom, and the United States. These are contexts with very different levels of scientific infrastructure and levels and types of religion. We focused on 2 dominant science disciplines, biology and physics, and all the subfields within those. These are disciplines with different intersections with religion. They're disciplines that delve deeply into the origins of humanity and of the universe. These are also disciplines with different proportions of women, and we know that gender is often connected to religious belief and practice, with women in most general populations in most nations studied and across all religious traditions, generally being more religious than men. We started by compiling a sampling frame or a massive list of 61,020 biologists and physicists who were eligible for our survey. We then took a random sample of 22,525 scientists to whom we sent our survey. And in total, 9,422 responded. Surveys, however, box people in. You are forced as the respondent to choose your answers to questions from options that were developed by the researchers. But religion is not something that is ever fully understood by researcher-created categories. So to gain a better understanding of religion among scientists, we got on planes and we attempted video conferencing calls and phone calls, and we conducted 609 in-depth interviews in these national and regional contexts. The first big point is that in each of the national contexts we studied, there are more religious scientists than many in the public and in the scientific community itself might think. Sociologists conceptualize religion in many different ways. We'll start by simply asking biologists and physicists if they see themselves as religious, and we'll compare the proportion of scientists that identify as religious to the proportion in the general population. This is important to consider because the nations with the biggest disparities in religiosity between scientists and the general public might have a harder time with dialogue between scientific and religious communities. In France, the UK, the US, and Hong Kong, between 16 and 39% of scientists see themselves as religious. This is indeed a significant minority of scientists. But look at this. When we move to Italy, Taiwan, Turkey, and India, we see that in each of these contexts, over 50% of scientists see themselves as religious. But still, scientists might be much less religious than the general population in their given regional context. And we do see that sometimes this is definitely the case. Scientists are indeed sometimes less religious than the members of a given general population. This gap is widest in France, where the general public is about 3 times more likely to identify as religious compared to scientists, followed by the US and UK. The gaps are more moderate in Italy and Turkey. At this point, I'd like to transition to my colleague, David Johnson, who will bring us to our second point about the particular ways in which Hong Kong and Taiwan are unique.
Thank you, Elaine. And now let us look at Hong Kong and Taiwan in particular. And I'm going to highlight unique dimensions of religious identification, religious affiliation, and service attendance in doing so. When we look at identifying as religious in Hong Kong and Taiwan, we see that the gaps are actually reversed compared to the other regions that we just reviewed. There's a significantly greater proportion of scientists who consider themselves religious when compared to the general population in these regions. And this was a finding that we didn't expect going into this study. Now let's look at how the religious character of the public compares to that of the biology and physics community in Hong Kong and Taiwan. And here we're focusing specifically on affiliating with a religious tradition. In Hong Kong, around 69% of both scientists and the general public have no religious affiliation. And we see that a pronounced representation of the Christian religions, with Protestants accounting for 13% of scientists, followed by Catholics at 6% of scientists. When we look at Taiwan, we see that scientists are much less religious, much less likely to claim a religious affiliation compared to the public. And this is noteworthy because when we simply ask scientists if they viewed themselves as a religious person, as we looked at just a moment ago, they were more likely to identify as religious compared to the public. And in Taiwan, we also see a greater presence of Buddhism and folk religions, roughly similar proportions of the public and scientists at about 18% identify with folk religions or beliefs. And finally, when we look at individuals who participate in religious services once a week or more, we see that scientists in both regions are somewhat more likely to do so compared to the general public. The overall proportions are low, as you can see, but this remains significant nevertheless because they represent a highly committed group and are more likely to be found among scientists than the general public. And of course, we were admittedly surprised by these patterns in the data. And to try and get a better sense on why we might be seeing these patterns, we looked at interviews that we conducted with scientists in both regions. And in Hong Kong, for example, there were some scientists who told us that there's a residual history of Christianity in the best primary and secondary schools, where many scientists noted that they received their first training. Other scientists noted that there was a great freedom to talk about religion among students and faculty at public research universities, especially those who are Christians and Buddhists. There were also many scientists in Hong Kong who noted that they were likely to meet to meet science faculty and administrators in Christian churches, which speaks to the strong social networks at churches among religious scientists. And finally, we also encountered a perception that a Christian elite controls science education. Of course, we'd be eager to hear your thoughts on why these patterns exist during the Q&A. When we look to Taiwan and the interviews there, scientists in Taiwan told us that religions like Buddhism and different folk religions are religious traditions that do not emphasize knowledge paradigms when compared to some forms of Christianity. They also told us that rather than being suppressed, that in Taiwan, religious pluralism is honored. That is to say, there are so many religious traditions present in Taiwan, religious traditions that make their way into the scientific workforce, as we'll discuss later. Instead of suppressing all discussion of religion and science, as we found in some of the other national contexts that we studied, our Taiwanese scientists tended to honor a robust form of religious pluralism. The third point that we want to make is that atheist scientists are much more varied than we might think, and much more varied than the types of vocal atheist narratives that we hear in the public sphere. Scientists globally have a popular conception, perhaps because of new atheists like Richard Dawkins or Sam Harris, that there's only one way to be an atheist, and that is to be vehemently against religion. But when we started to drill down on the data of the atheists that we studied, that's not exactly what we found. There's considerable variation across the national context that we studied in the proportion of scientists who are convinced atheists. And there's also important national variations in the differences between scientists and the general public when it comes to atheism. We see large magnitudes of difference in France, the United Kingdom, the United States, Italy, and Turkey. And when we look in particular at Hong Kong and Taiwan, we see that the direction is actually reverse, where the general population is more likely to affirm atheism when compared to scientists in these regions. To get a better sense of what's going on here, we turned once again to our interview data and looked at different types of atheist scientists in our research. And we found basically that there's three broad categories. First, a group we call the Modernist Atheists. These are scientists who are convinced that there's no God, and they have absolutely no participation in any form of religious organization, and they rarely, if ever, interact with religious individuals. And we found that even these scientists do not necessarily agree with the types of narratives that are advanced by vocal atheists like Richard Dawkins. Many think that there's a potential for religion to actually be beneficial and helpful to society under certain conditions. For example, we did an interview with a biologist in the United Kingdom who was very much of this opinion. So if religion is moderate and if it's intelligent and conscious, then I think it's very beneficial. If it's irrational and hysterical and dogmatic, then I think it can be very dangerous and can block science. And we found narratives like this in other regions that we studied, including in Hong Kong and Taiwan, where we heard conversations like this from scientists who immigrated from China. I credit my non-religion to my upbringing in communist China, and because they at least told us the truth, that there was no God. Depend on yourself to achieve whatever you wish to achieve. Don't depend on God who plans everything for you. And that definitely is the truth. The Chinese Communist government told us to believe that rather than being deceived by Western religions. A second category of atheists that we found in our analyses, we call spiritual atheists. During our interviews with atheist scientists, many of them talked about seeing their work exploring the mysteries of the natural world or the cosmos as spiritual in some way. As one biologist that we spoke with told us, I think my definition of spirituality is fairly nebulous. The goal of my work is service to humanity, to impart a sense of wonder, and so that's all part of my worldview that encompasses spirituality as well. And a third category that we uncovered, which is perhaps most likely to break some of the public stereotypes that atheist scientists are all against religious people, we found that there are atheist scientists who actively participate in religious organizations. They have consistent and ongoing interactions with religious individuals. And here's a sense of what that looks like, according to one UK reader in physics who said, I have no problem going to church services. It looks like it's like looking at another part of your culture, but I have no faith religiously. It doesn't worry me that religion is still out there. And this approach to being an atheist, but also participating in religious practices, took on a particular character in Taiwan. As one physicist told us, it's just that my elders have such a practice, and so I do it, but rationally, I don't believe in it. It's unnecessary for us to pick a fight with what our ancestors believed. Lots of times we follow their practices. Unless you're totally unwilling to do so, more or less you would pick up some ancestral worshiping practices. Indeed, we spoke with several atheist scientists in Taiwan who participate in religious rituals with their families and religious and traditional festivals without attributing religious meanings to such practices. So overall, when we look at the survey data and interview data on atheist scientists, we see that they're much more varied than the types of images we see in the public sphere. So our research shows that there's considerable types of diversity in the types of atheism that they profess, meaning that anti-religious narratives that people may hear in the global public sphere do not actually reflect what most atheist scientists and actually think about religion. And you'll be able to read more about this topic in our book, Varieties of Atheism in Science. The fourth big point that we want to make today is that most scientists do not think that there's a conflict between religion and science. And this is true across all of the contexts that we studied. We asked scientists to respond to a survey question describing the relationship between religion and science, whether it's one of conflict, one of independence, or one of collaboration. The dominant view for scientists in these 8 nations and regions is that science and religion refer to different aspects of reality, which is reminiscent of the paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould's idea of non-overlapping magisteria. In both Hong Kong and Taiwan, we see that the largest proportions of scientists in each region embrace the independence view. About 48% of scientists in Hong Kong and 66% of scientists in Taiwan see religion as independent from one another. Let's take a look at this view a little bit more carefully. Here's what this looks like through the eyes of a Taiwanese scientist who believes that science and religion trigger different parts of the brain. You use different blocks in the brain when you're doing religious activities and when you're doing science. It's totally different. So apparently these two don't conflict with one another. Or as one scientist in Hong Kong told us, I don't think there's any fundamental connection between the two, although I do appreciate that in history, a lot of scientific findings were made by religious scholars. And we found numerous other narratives like this in both in these regions and all of the other regions that we studied. There is indeed a minority of scientists in each national context who do view science and religion as being in conflict, especially in France, the United Kingdom, and the United States, but even there, it never rises to more than 1/3 of the scientists in each of these regions. But there's also a strong minority, especially in Hong Kong, India, Taiwan, and Turkey, that view science and religion as having the ability to collaborate. As one biology student told us, for me personally, I don't experience a conflict. My religious side guides my hope for my professional work, and my professional work guides my openness to religion. As another example from Hong Kong, I wouldn't say it's a conflict. They actually help one another out. The way I see it, of course, I think they enhance one another. But when they exist in isolation, it's not necessarily healthy to separate the physical world and the spiritual world. You should try to understand your limitation and appreciate the created order. So in sum, for this point, Our research shows that the popular idea that science and religion are at war with one another or in conflict is simply not true for the vast majority of scientists. And now I'm going to turn to my colleague Dee Dee, who will discuss how religion comes up in the scientific workplace.
Thank you, Dave. Our fifth biggest point to make is that religion comes up in the scientific workplace even for these scientists who are not personally religious, and that religion comes up in scientific workplace in distinctive ways in Hong Kong and Taiwan. In our broader cross-national data, we found that religion can come into the scientific workplace even for these scientists who are not personally religious. And here we are going to talk about 4 ways that religion enters the scientific workplace in Hong Kong and Taiwan. Through research, sometimes scientists told us that religion helps them to resolve scientific difficulties. Through teaching and mentoring, to support students well. Through ethics, to use science to support others. And in issues of freedom and accommodation, to foster religious freedom and accommodation. We have written a couple of articles about these and other topics if you would like to refer to them. Scientists in Taiwan sometimes discuss the ways in which that their religious tradition supported their scientific work. For example, we talked with this Taiwanese biologist who practiced folk religions. He informed us that he has received supernatural guidance from his deity when he was doing his research. He said, "After I'm done writing my papers, before I send them to journals, I would go and ask him, the deity, to review it for me. He would take my draft. He would take the ink brush and the cinnabar, and he would make edits. He would be like, 'Look, you wrote this poorly, and there's something wrong there.' Once I carefully looked into it, I would discover that, really, I did make a mistake." Sometimes scientists told us that religion informs their teaching, mentoring, and how they connect with their students. A biologist in Hong Kong who identifies as a Christian told us, "Religion comes up in teaching a little bit. I can only say this where I teach a system, a particular system in biology. The system is perfect or near perfect. That's how I speak to the idea that this must be a design. That's all I can say. I don't use the word God, but I have my point to discuss." In Taiwan, a physicist who also identifies as Christian told us that religion helps her to connect with her students. She said, "Some students don't necessarily like physics that much. There are huge gaps here between my expectations and that of the students. When I find the gap overwhelming, I rely on my faith to learn how to be patient. There is a quote from 1 Corinthians in the Bible about love. Love suffers long and is kind. As a teacher, I have to have this character." We also found that across most of the regions that we studied, religion informs scientists' ethical framework. For example, this biologist in the UK told us, "Religion provides a check on those occasions where you might be tempted to shortcut because you want to get something published, and you think, oh, that experiment wasn't really good enough, but if I portray it in this way, that will do." In Hong Kong and Taiwan, religion similarly comes up in scientist research ethics. But different from the narratives that we heard in other regions that we studied, in Hong Kong and Taiwan, some scientists who practice Buddhism or folk religions told us that religion comes up in their research ethics when they are doing animal research. This biologist in Hong Kong told us, "Religion is somewhat important to research ethics. I tend to be more mindful of animal research. I try to respect all life and try not to cause harm to the animal subject." Finally, we found that scientists in Hong Kong and Taiwan expressed a greater sense of freedom to discuss religion at work compared to scientists in the other regional contexts that we studied. For instance, a Taiwanese physicist described inviting his colleagues to his church. He said, "Yes, I would invite people to dinners at my church. Some would come, some would oppose." Another physicist in Taiwan similarly informed us, "We have just started a Bible study group for professors. We Christian professors lead this group, and we invite some non-Christian professors in our department to participate. Some of them are interested in it. They want to know more about the Bible, so we invite them to read the Bible with us." Indeed, our survey data affirms what we heard in the interviews. 1/3 of Hong Kong scientists indicated on survey that they are very comfortable discussing religion in the workplace, while half of the Taiwanese scientists said the same. This is much greater than what we found in other regions in this study. Since publishing our book, Secularity and Science, we have started looking at the other issues in relation to scientific experiences in the scientific community. One of the issues that we focus on is gender diversity and the lack of gender diversity in science. According to our survey data, across all 8 contexts, there are more men than women in both biology and physics, with the exception of biology in Italy and Turkey. As you can see here, compared to biology, there are even fewer women in physics across different contexts. It is also important to know that this data pulls graduate students with professors of various ranks. If we were to break out the ranks, the picture would be even more stark. As gender diversity is a pressing issue in the global scientific community, we then ask, what are the factors contributing to the lack of women in academic science in general and in some scientific disciplines, such as physics in particular? One explanation can be women's experiences of gender discrimination. That is, women may begin their career in science, but leave as a result of how they are treated. This may be one of the reasons to explain why women are especially underrepresented in higher ranks of academic science. Here, we illustrate percentage of women who have experienced some gender discrimination in Taiwan and Hong Kong. And the green bar represents the statistics in Taiwan, and the dark blue bar represents the statistics in Hong Kong. As we can see, in Taiwan, about 21% of women have experienced some gender discrimination, and this percentage is 28% in Hong Kong. Taking a closer look at women's experiences of gender discrimination in the 2 disciplines, we recognize that there is a slightly higher percentage of women experiencing gender discrimination in physics. This pattern is applicable to both contexts, but is even more salient in Taiwan. Career stage does not play a very salient role in women's experiences of gender discrimination in Taiwan. There is a slightly higher percentage of senior scientists who have experienced gender discrimination in Taiwan. In Hong Kong, a higher percentage of mid-career scientists have experienced some gender discrimination. The interviews we conducted can also help us to understand the patterns in relation to gender diversity. In Taiwan and Hong Kong, we found that some scientists believe that it is difficult for women to enter, retain, and survive in academic sciences in general and some scientific disciplines in particular because of the cultural expectations for science and family conflict. For instance, this biologist in Hong Kong explained, "It gets more and more difficult for women, particularly those in the tenure track who have children, young children. In science, it is very difficult to do a few years, then spend some years away, and then come back again. You are just falling behind. This is true even in biology." Other scientists attribute the difficulties that women experience to the gender and cultural expectations in the broader society. This physicist in Taiwan explained, especially in Taiwan and other Asian countries. The role of a woman in a family involves a lot of things, such as child raising and housekeeping. Even if women do not want to do it, their elders or other people may expect them to. Our respondents believe that the difficulties women experiences in the scientific community in Hong Kong and Taiwan is partially attributed to the culture in academic science that privilege men. In addition, some gender and culture expectations in Hong Kong and Taiwan can contribute to the lack of representation of women in science in general and in some scientific disciplines, such as physics in particular. I will now turn this presentation back to my colleague, Elaine Howard Ecklund.
Thank you so much, Didi. And thank all of you again. And now, stepping back from the data we have presented today, I want to conclude by emphasizing just what important cases Hong Kong and Taiwan represent in our broader study, in ways that we have just began to touch on today. To recap, we found that overall, scientists are more religious than most people think, that atheist scientists are more varied than most typically assume, as evidenced by rich examples of spirituality and cultural participation in religion among atheist scientists in several of the different national contexts we study. We also see that the conflict view of science and religion does not seem salient for Hong Kong and Taiwan scientists. And perhaps more than other contexts we studied, religion often enters the scientific workplace in Hong Kong and Taiwan in rich and varied ways. And finally, in our broader work, we find that cultural norms seem to be an important barrier to gender diversity in science. These patterns underscore the importance of studying science and religion in an international comparative context, even though it's very difficult to do so, and we have just begun that kind of study here. And they point also, again, to the significance of both Taiwan alongside our other cases as science communities that highlight, under certain conditions, a rich and productive interface between science and religion. Thank you again for taking the time to attend this lecture in the midst of the global pandemic. And thank you especially to Professor Pauline Chu and the Faith and Science Collaborative Research Forum at the University of Hong Kong, and to Professor David Palmer and Dr. Michael Brownnutt. Now we want to stop screen sharing and transition at this point to having us field some questions to answer about this work. I can see that we already have a number of questions submitted. As a reminder, please do go ahead and use the question answer button to submit a question. We have about 15 minutes, I think, and we'll do our best to address your questions. So I'm going to field the questions, and I'll try to answer some of them and then point some to Didi and Dave did as well. So the first is the fact that more scientists consider themselves to be religious when compared to the public in Hong Kong and Taiwan, maybe due in part to how these scientists define and understand religion and spirituality. Didi, why don't you go ahead and answer that question if you could?
Yeah, thank you, Elaine, for directing this question to me, and thank you for this excellent question. We believe that scientists' definition of religion and spirituality, especially how different their definition of religion and spirituality in Taiwan and Hong Kong when compared to the other contexts that we studied, may be a reason to explain why we have observed the so-called differences between Taiwan, Hong Kong, and the rest of contexts that we have studied. In our book, we have included scientists' narratives, especially how they define religion and spirituality in their own words, to try to find out some supportive evidence or try to establish the link between their definition of religion and spirituality to what we have observed in our statistics. I would happy to talk more about what we have found in our book, but this is what the broad picture of what we have already found when we were writing the chapter on Taiwan and Hong Kong.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you. So the next question is, what do your findings show regarding why in Hong Kong and Taiwan it's easier to discuss religion at work compared to the other regions studied? David, did you want to take that one?
Sure, I can take a stab at that. I recall from our data that most people did say that they were comfortable in Hong Kong and Taiwan. It was about 36% of scientists in Hong Kong said they were comfortable and 48% in Taiwan. If you look at it the other way, the proportion who say they're uncomfortable, it's 1 to 2% in Hong Kong and Taiwan, which was actually that people who were uncomfortable was closer to 10% in all of the other regions that we studied. And it might be because there's simply less conflict in the public sphere in Hong Kong and Taiwan compared to a place like the United States, where we see recurring debates about evolution. I do remember that in 2009, there was a debate over evolution in Hong Kong, and there was also other examples in 2014 of a social service organization who was trying to hold a science event in a park that it advocated creationism. And so I think somehow it has something to do with the absence of these intense debates in the public sphere that probably make it a little bit easier to speak about it in the scientific workplace. Whereas in a place like the United States, where there's lots of public debates, it's seen as much more contentious and people are much less likely to want to bring these things up. That's my best guess.
That's great, David. Thank you so much. The statistics on the next question is, or the comment, the statistics on no folk religion and no Taoists in Hong Kong rather do not represent the reality. Folk religion is the main form of religion in Hong Kong, and Taoism, which is hard to distinguish from folk religion, is widespread in Hong Kong. The most popular religious place of worship in Hong Kong is a Taoist temple. Most funerals use Taoist priests and rituals. Taoist elements are pervasive in the culture. The survey data is based on people who are conscious, who do not consciously identify with folk religion or Taoism. I think the person who made this statement is making some excellent points and pointing, I think, to some of the limitations of survey data, where we did ask people to choose one that best represents them. And I think when we got on the ground in Hong Kong and did face-to-face interviews with scientists there, we did notice much more complexity than we were able to get through survey data, if that makes sense. So I think there's this is a different kind of study than might have been conducted if we were doing more of an area studies specialist perspective. But this is an excellent statement and one that we take very seriously and shows the value of multiple forms of data collection. Anything else that you all want to add on those? I've kind of, for sake of time, had each of us answer only one question, but before I go on, is there anything else that David or Dee Dee that you want to jump in on that, or others?
The only thing I would add is, and I'm not an expert in this area, but it's possible that people engage in these practices without attributing it to a specific religious tradition. And so that might not show up on a survey.
So the next question is, would non-religious scientists be undersampled? This is another good question. Would be undersampled in your research, as perhaps many secular ones may choose not to fill out the survey or be interviewed. They may perceive your organization is leaning towards being pro-religious, at least on the surface. We would have, I'll take a stab at that, and then you two feel free to jump in. But we were obsessed with this topic when we were doing this survey. I'm kind of smiling a bit because our team gathered here knows that we spent so much time trying to find advisors from different personal religious perspectives and from different kinds of institutions in order to convince others that the survey was not biased towards a perspective. In fact, we had a sizable number of scientists critique us for the other, that actually the survey perhaps was too biased towards atheist scientists and things like that. So we felt kind of good because our critiques came in both directions. But it's very hard to look at what we call non-respondent bias. We did collect a lot of information on the entire sampling frame of scientists. We, of course, could not get their religiosity because they chose not to participate, but we did try even to do some interviews with non-respondents to try to figure out the character of that population who chose not to participate.
I would just add, Elaine, if I might, we used
Please.
to joke that if you threw a rock, you're more likely to find a non-religious scientist than a religious one, at least in highly secular contexts like the United States, the United Kingdom, or excuse me, like the United Kingdom and France, and certainly the scientific community in the United States. And one of the things that we did was we didn't frame the study necessarily as a study of religion. We called it the Science and International Context Initiative. And we talked about how we were emphasizing things that a lot of scientists cared about, like work and family, gender, ethics, the commercialization of science, and religion. So it was included as one of many emphases in studying the social context of science. So it wasn't presented to scientists as, we're interested in your religious beliefs. The data on religion were but one component of a much broader and more multidimensional survey. And so I think it's not likely that we have severe bias in our results as it relates to non-religious scientists not wanting to complete it. Thank you.
Thank you. The next question is the reference to God and religion would have different kinds of connotations in different regions. In particular, there may be a kind of difference in meaning of those terms between Asian national contexts when compared to, say, European or US or the US context. Dee Dee, did you want to respond to that statement?
Yes, I definitely agree with that statement. But when we were designing the survey, we tried to contextualize this survey. This means we did a lot of work to make sure that what we refer to as God, deity, or religion is matched to people's daily expression of these words. And of course, when we were doing interviews, we had more space and more opportunities to engage in conversations with our respondents and to gather a deeper and more contextualized understanding of what they mean by by saying God, what they mean by saying religion, what they mean by saying spirituality. So we totally agree with this statement, and we have incorporated a lot of the thoughts in relation to this statement in our study design.
Yeah, it's these kinds of studies, that's a great response, Dee Dee. These kinds of studies are so huge, but then you get in there and you start thinking all of the things we could have done if we had even more time and money. So these questions are making me think that. So seems that the next question is, seems that some scientists refer to their religious traditions to sustain their ethical integrity in doing research. That's accurate, I think. Do atheist scientists do so equally? And if not, do they not mention ethical challenges simply, or do they resolve them differently? David, did you want to take that?
The main response that I have to that question, it makes me think of scientists in countries like, or the regions like the United Kingdom, where they had a lot of formal exposure to religion through educational institutions, regardless of whether they were religious or not. And so when asked about whether or not any sense of religion informs their approach to ethics and science, they, in some way, shape, or form, would draw on a religious tradition in mentioning sort of moralities that they embrace. And so yes, I think that even atheists draw on religious traditions in some way, even if they no longer embrace views they might have been exposed to as in their adolescence. The other point that I would make is that in the second book that Elaine and I have coming out, we have a chapter that focuses specifically on meaning and morality, and we looked at different measures of morality in the survey with an interest in whether or not atheist scientists and religious scientists are any different in the extent to which they embrace certain moral values, because there's this narrative out there that atheists are immoral because they don't embrace religious beliefs. And in fact, we found there's absolutely no difference between religious and non-religious scientists in terms of their commitment to or identification with a variety of moral values.
Oh, that's good. Yeah, that's good. And really important, I think to stress. Thank you for that, David. The next question is, what is the connection between gender and religion in science? Do you look at religion intersectionally alongside race and class? Do you differentiate between minority and majority or elite religions? That's a good comment there. My experience in Hong Kong, for example, is that elite religions like Christianity are often more accepted than marginalized religions that are more discriminated against. I don't know if I can do so many things at once, but let me put an article in the chat to both panelists and attendees.
And while Elaine's doing that, I'll tell you, we did look at various differences as it relates to gender, and not necessarily at eliteness of religions, but at institutions. And just one type of difference by gender that I would point out is in the proportion of scientists who embrace the conflict narrative, that scientists believe that science and religion are in conflict with one another. And in Hong Kong, we found basically that 20% of male scientists think that science and religion are in conflict with one another, compared to 6% of women. In Taiwan, we found, we also looked at these things by discipline. It's another way that we compared our data. And the interesting thing we found in Hong Kong, forgive me, is that 21% of physicists think that science and religion are in conflict with one another, compared to 12% of biologists. And that's actually the reverse of what we found in some of the other regions. In part, I think because evolution has been this big basis for conflict, we typically find that biologists are more likely to embrace the conflict narrative than physicists, but that's different than what we saw in Hong Kong. So we do try to look at a more intersectional approach. Of course, we'd love to present all of these things in a presentation like this, but you kind of have to boil down to a broad one broad dimension, which is what we find in this country, so that we can show you how these regions compare to all of the other contexts in our study.
I, of course, neglected to remember that there are folks who are in person in an auditorium. So if you cannot see the chat, the article that I just put is called "Doing Gender and Doing Religion in Science Across National Examination." And that piece was published in the Journal for the Scientific Study of Religion, and is based on these data. Thank you, David, for jumping in there while I was looking that up. Another question, regarding professionalism in the workplace, did the data reflect how postgraduate students may have felt influenced or not by the religious beliefs of their supervisors? Dee Dee, did you want to take that?
Yeah, from what I recall in the data, we did not hear similar narratives, but we indeed have heard some narratives of their advisors and professors sometimes try to introduce religion in what we call as non-scientific institutional sphere in the scientific workplace. That is the institutional sphere that do not directly engage in discussions in scientific topics. And we have also published a paper that discusses how Taiwanese scientists sometimes carefully introduce religion in the workplace. So simply put, we have heard the other way around, that graduate advisors may have introduced the religion consciously or unconsciously, but not the way that graduate students are being influenced by the faith embodied by their graduate advisors.
And I would add that a more prevalent type of narrative that we would encounter is and I don't want to put this in statistical terms, but in interviews, you hear graduate students talking about religious graduate students in the US or the UK experiencing what they perceive as some form of discrimination by their advisors. And we even have heard scientists themselves talk about some modicum of discrimination. So you can think about it in both ways, the advisor's religious beliefs or the advisor's lack of religious beliefs having an impact on their relationship with students. And then in India, it takes on all different types of forms because there's more people who tend to be the same religion in India compared to most of the other contexts that we studied. So it varies across contexts.
I'm being told now running out of time to continue answering the questions. Unfortunately, we got through, I think, about half of them. So you may email us if you'd like to have some email dialogue. I will put my email there. And we really appreciate you coming to this lecture and participating in the discussion. And thank you again for joining us for Science and Religion, Why Hong Kong and Taiwan Are Different. We are so honored that you have spent this time with us. We will also, we want you to know, be distributing a copy of our PowerPoint slides to you all, as well as sending out a survey so that you might provide some additional thoughts on the presentation. We would greatly appreciate your feedback. And once again, I really can't say it enough. Thank you. And in these times, of course, for all of us, it's always worth saying as well, be well. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.